Welcome to the Oration Films video interview. This is the very first one, so we're experimenting a little bit. And today we're looking at one of the participants in the film Delirium, which will soon be having its world premiere and is due to go out in the UK in the middle of the year. Fiona Howe is producer of the movie, and she's also the composer of the soundtrack. And the film is one that focuses very much on music because the main character is a composer, formerly a rock star, who returns to his former university college music school in order to perform a commission for a requiem mass for the college's founder. So Fiona Howe is joining me now. Good morning, Fiona. Or good afternoon,
Hello,
actually.
hi Tim. Nice to be with you from the other side of the
Yes, yes.
Atlantic. Hi there.
So, so let's start with talking about Delirium and how you came up with the idea to do a film based on a kind of soundtrack idea, in a sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting one for me too. It was quite a big adventure, I must say, but very exciting to be part of the story creation as well, because it's a story about a composer. The process of composing the piece of music was actually it was integrated in the script, and so that formed part of the thinking behind the composition as well. I mean, we knew what sort of shape. Obviously, it's a predetermined format. We knew what a requiem should be like in its entirety. We knew we didn't need all of a requiem, but obviously, I had to write quite a lot of a requiem in order to fit in around the plot. So yeah, it was interesting, kind of putting myself in the head of the character to work out, what kind of a requiem would that person write. It's not exactly what kind of a requiem would Fiona Howe write without the film. So they're bound up with each other. There's not really an easy way of separating them.
One thing I was kind of intrigued by is the character in the story is someone who started out rebelliously as and became a rock star, and then has moved into more formal classical composition. And you yourself, I don't know whether you were rebellious, but you started out as a performer and you've been a singer, and you have also transitioned, I guess, into composing in this way. How much of you do you think is in the character, and can you tell me a little bit more about your progress?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, to be honest, the character himself is not closely linked to me, probably more closely linked to Gareth, my partner, but because he started off as a performer and a busker, and had a kind of early musical career as well. But from my point of view, I guess I was a little bit I was classically trained from an early age. I did start at conservatoire. At least I did my kind of first part examinations, and then I swapped to literature. So then the word took over for quite a few years. And but the thing is about music, if it's what you love, it never truly leaves you alone. And I was really happy to kind of pick it up again when the moment became right, and the time when it became right was more or less around the production of Desire. And we needed a kind of ambient, very simple, kind of sparse track for that. And so I started working on that through kind of improvisations and working with the story of that film. And at the same time working as a singer-songwriter as well. I mean, a lot of the songs that I wrote around that time are sort of quite intricately bound up with the soundtrack of Desire. So from then it's been a sort of 6 or 7 year progress towards writing this full-scale choral and orchestral work, which has been challenging but really very exciting for me.
So tell me something about the process of moving to. I mean, I don't know how much formal training you had as a composer, or is it something that sort of developed organically out of the kind of music you've been singing and writing in the past?
Sure. It's a good question. I mean, I've had some composition training because my classical training is what it is, and you don't escape without doing a lot of theory, music theory, and structuring, and writing string quartets and Bach chorales and all the rest of it. So I've had a full grounding in basic harmony and all the rules, enough to learn how to break them. And that's the great pleasure about doing a lot of the work that I've done recently. I mean, taking on a big choral work, you make certain assumptions, and then you realize that you're not going to be writing a formal classical requiem in the style that Mozart might have done. It's very different and more fluid and more free because of the nature of the character who's writing it in the film. So I suppose I started with a classical straitjacket and then kind of eased back from it and found myself, and then eased back into the sort of classical world a little bit.
So we've talked about that because it is in some ways a chamber music requiem in the sense that it's not gigantic forces such as people think of with Verdi and things like that. I mean, how big is it as a composition?
Okay, so we had a 30-strong choir, and we had a chamber orchestra of about a dozen or 15 people at most. So yeah, chamber style, but not. It wasn't weenie. It relates a little bit to the kind of. It kind of it's linked in a way to Mermaid's work, my album, which I released last year. That was scored for strings and piano and my voice and flute. So, I mean, I was kind of growing a kind of arrangement idea, but, you know, a requiem is something completely different. And so many voices. I mean, I think what's really, really exciting and really lovely is being able to work with 4-part choir and just that big sound. Because even if you only have 30 people in a chapel with a lovely big vaulted roof, you know, you're going to hear something wonderful, and it sounds huge, actually.
One of the things about the music that I think is interesting is the fact that you have some sounds that perhaps are not quite so conventional in that format, what I would suppose you'd call world music kind of elements. How did you decide to take that approach, particularly in, I guess, the Libre Armée section is one that I think of specifically starting out that way?
Okay, so these world sounds. I mean, I'm I've got a lot I could say about that. It's quite interesting. I mean, obviously, it's a characterized requiem because it's written for a film, a story about somebody writing one. So, in a way, the textures that I've used are partly arising from the fact that I had thought myself into the mind of this person, and his journey is that he discovers a whole life below stairs that he didn't know anything about. He's actually the high master of the college, and he goes underground at night, and this whole musical world opens up for him. So those sounds, those textures. So, for example, in the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, there's a big drum sound. I mean, we've got huge drums and percussion in that, lots of brass. That was probably influenced by, you know, the idea that there are many other cultures influencing this particular character, and they start fermenting in his mind. The Balkan sound, well, it's a story about a young woman who's a musician, a Russian musician, in fact, but she is also a migrant and a refugee from conflict. But, you know, the idea of moving through into Eastern Europe, I think it was also kind of linked to the other musicians that the composer character meets along the way. So the Libre Armée is a kind of manic tango, I think, Balkan style.
I think you know, you've talked about it being in line with the character and the story of the film. On the other hand, you know, it is one of the reasons we're doing this conversation now is that you have fairly recently released the soundtrack as a standalone musical item, and we'll give people the details of how to find that later on if they haven't already got them. And I think it does stand up on its own, so I wanted to approach a more general question about looking at it as a musical form. We mentioned Mozart earlier. Obviously, the Requiem Mass is one of the, a sort of musical form that is associated with some very highly well-known pieces. Verdi, Mozart recently, Lloyd Webber did it, and it's also something that has elements which are outside of music itself. It comes with a sort of story behind it because it's associated with funerals and things like this. And I wondered how difficult it was for you as a relatively new composer in that sense to sort of suddenly say, gosh, I'm doing something that so many people have done before, and what can I bring to it?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's a nice question. I think when you start to compose a piece, yes, of course, you're aware of the precedents. I love Fauré's Requiem, but that's an elegy for a lost son. I love Mozart's Requiem because it is so angry, because he's obviously foreshadowing his own death. I think, on the other hand, you listen to requiems, you then put them to one side. You have to, because you've got to write organically. You've got to write your own piece of music. So I think, I didn't feel scared. I felt excited. And as I say, I think the big adventure was actually finding those voices. I mean, for me, because I'm a songwriter, melody is where I start from, but also the kind of harmonic structure is really, really important. I quite like added note harmony, and I just, you work your way into it as a structure. I didn't want it to be a very formal thing, but some people have said, oh yeah, but that first movement, that Kyrie, is a bit like Palestrina, isn't it? And ooh, there are shades of Elgar there, and there are little, obviously there are fragments and nods at other composers, because you are working in a tradition, but in the end, the most important thing is that it comes together with its own kind of homogeneity. It's got to kind of work as a whole. But it's a fairly it's a difficult piece to write, because it is, a lot of people associate it with the passing of somebody, and the memorialization of that person. I mean, in the film, it's not really about that. It's about the marking of a centenary of a patron of the college. So it's not particularly threatening in that sense. But it's a fairly sort of daunting tradition to kind of work within. But no, I've done this. I'm going to write a symphony. It's very exciting. I'm going to work forward into some new sounds and structures.
I think there are two questions I come to out of that. The first one is relating to the Requiem, and the other one is going to be about your future in this field. But going to the question of the Requiem one, you mentioned about it being associated with death, and I noticed that you've titled it as a standalone composition, Requiem for the Living, and I thought, that'll be good, that'll be easy to Google and find. And then I went onto iTunes and found, gosh, quite a few people starting from the late 19th century have done that. And I thought, were you kind of aware of that being a little phenomenon in itself, or is it just something that sort of suited your approach to the composition?
Yeah, I think more the latter. I mean, I didn't want it to be something stuck in a kind of stone building and just remote from people. I think Requiem makes us think about who we are, about our mortality. There's a kind of poetic, meditative quality to it, which I really, really like. So that was one thing. It's very important to me, and also to the story of the film, that we're remembering and honouring people in difficulty, migrants who are in our midst, who are coming from lives of extreme difficulty, and that's a major theme in the film. And actually, the relationship between the composer's work to sort of honour the living, and not to forget about them, not to put them in a box, was really essential to the story. So I think that's where it seeded itself in my mind. But I actually found out that there were other people who'd written Requiem for the living, and I thought, well, but it's actually it's a nice. Maybe it is a subgenre, I don't know, but I really like it. It's got a bit of energy and forward-moving perspective, which I like.
Yeah, no, I thought it was an intriguing little discovery, actually, that aspect of it, and finding out what they might have. So, obviously, composition is something that's been a developing thing for you from, relatively simple, simple in terms of forces, song writing, to something like this with more parts. And you've mentioned that you might try and write a symphony. How are you feeling about going forward into more extensive composition?
I'm keen to do that. I think you always start, whether you're a songwriter or a band or a composer, you're working with musicians, so it's partly about available resources, it's partly about who you want to work with. So I'm very interested in obviously I'd love to sit down and write a symphony, and I have my contacts, so I think if you're able to experiment, why not? But I just at the same time, realism will dictate that I probably end up doing some more experimental work with smaller numbers of musicians at the same time. I mean, I'm quite keen to do a kind of octet with piano and strings and percussion and some voice, that kind of thing. So yeah, there'll be different forms that I'm working with alongside my duties as producer. But it's just how many hours are there in a day? But it's time to sort of set aside another chunk of time to do some composing. I think that would be great.
Well, getting back to the composing in the film context specifically, I was thinking about it, and there's been a lot of focus in the past year or so particularly on women's roles in the film industry in parts where they haven't been particularly well presented. And I would say that probably composition has been one of those areas where the image of the film composer that leaps to mind doesn't necessarily suggest a female behind it. I mean, is that something you've thought about or something you're interested in?
I think it's really, really important that female composers are getting, at least there's an awareness now in the industry, both in the film industry and, the music industry as a whole. There's more support for women composers, and I think that cannot be but a good thing. I'm very interested in working with other female practitioners, and I think that's an exciting possibility moving forward. I'm actually going to be giving a sort of lecture recital at Bangor in the autumn about women in composition and women making music. So it's all part of a forward thrusting initiative, I think.
So, getting back to the musical situation immediately, I wondered about the future of the Requiem itself. It struck me as the kind of composition that could work for small forces to perform, for local choral societies or things like that. I mean, is that something you might hope could happen?
Yeah. We're working on that. I mean, I've got feelers out to several choral societies at the moment, and they're quite keen. I mean, it's interesting. The Kyrie is not a difficult piece actually in terms of where it lies for the voice, and I think if you can, it's really just a question of recruiting interest. If they like the music, then they think about doing it. So yes, it would be great to have some performances lined up across the autumn and into November, December time. I suppose with Christmas coming up, so we'll be aiming it for that. Yeah.
Okay, well listen, thank you very much, and I think let's just say as a final wind-up, where can people find the music?
Okay, they can find it on iTunes, They can find it on Spotify, but I don't like sending people there because, I'll get pennies back. They can find it on my own website, which is the best way of supporting the composer, which is fionahowe.com/requiem. And they can find it on Bandcamp. There's a way of buying it there, which is also a very musician-friendly, composer-friendly site. So that's fionahowe.bandcamp.com.
Great. Well, we'll try and include that information on the link when we publish the video. Fiona, thank you very much. And thank you for all watching the first Oration video. We'll be back hopefully in a couple of weeks, maybe with something from Cannes.